My name is Lyra, and for the first 25 years of my life, I lived in a gilded cage, where I was not the bird, but the keeper of the cage's key, a key nobody realized existed. I grew up in the shadow of my best friend, Harriet Hayes, a girl so breathtakingly beautiful that the world rearranged itself around her just to get a better look. Her father was Ambassador Roland Hayes, a man who believed the most powerful tool in diplomacy was a perfectly tailored suit and a disarmingly beautiful daughter. I was the other daughter, the one not of his blood, the clever, quiet girl who haunted the embassy library like a well-read ghost. I never expected that the dusty, forgotten language I taught myself in those silent rooms would one day become the only thing standing between two nations and the deafening roar of war. I never imagined that my entire life of being overlooked would become the sweetest, most profound revenge of all, a victory won not in the spotlight my friend occupied, but in the shadows where true power so often hides. Before I dive into the story of how a forgotten scroll changed everything, I want to connect with all of you out there. Let me know where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. And if you've ever felt invisible or had your talents dismissed, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new faces here, make sure you subscribe to join a community of people who understand that sometimes the quietest voice has the most important thing to say. Our story, mine and Harriet's, didn't begin with the threat of war. It began, as these things often do, in the small, seemingly harmless moments of childhood that lay the foundations for the rest of your life. My parents had been junior attaches at the same embassy where Roland Hayes was just beginning his ascent. They died in a car accident when I was 5, a tragedy that left me an orphan in a foreign country. Roland, a man who valued loyalty and appearances above all else, took me in. It was a grand gesture, one that earned him accolades and cemented his reputation as a benevolent patriarch. He raised me alongside his own daughter, Harriet, who was my age to the day. On the surface, it was a fairy tale. 2 girls, growing up in the palatial splendor of embassies around the world, inseparable sisters in all but name. But beneath that surface, our paths were carved into 2 very different landscapes. Harriet was born of sunlight and honey. Her hair was the color of spun gold, her eyes the shade of a summer sky. From the moment she could walk, she commanded attention. Adults would stop mid-sentence to coo over her, to marvel at the perfect symmetry of her face. I was not. I was quiet, with mousy brown hair that never quite behaved, and eyes that were more interested in the words on a page than the people in a room. While Harriet was learning which smile could coax an extra dessert from a chef, I was learning ancient Greek in the hushed quiet of the library. I remember one particular afternoon when we were perhaps 10 years old. The embassy was hosting a garden party for the children of the diplomatic corps. Harriet was dressed in a confection of pink tulle, looking like a miniature princess. She was the center of a giggling circle of children, her laughter ringing like tiny bells. I was sitting under a sprawling jacaranda tree, my nose buried in a thick book about the Punic Wars. An elderly countess, a woman with a face like a wrinkled map, approached me. She peered down at my book through her lorgnette. My, she'd clucked. Such a serious little thing. You should be playing with the others. I simply looked up at her and said, I am playing. Hannibal is about to cross the Alps. The Countess didn't understand. She patted my head with a soft, dismissive pity before drifting back toward the sunlight where Harriet was holding court. Later that day, Ambassador Hayes found me. He didn't ask about my book. He didn't ask about Hannibal or his elephants. He knelt beside me, his gaze fixed on his own daughter. Look at her, Lyra, he said, his voice thick with a pride that was almost tangible. She has a gift. She makes people happy just by being. That is a rare and powerful thing. He then looked at me, and his smile became something softer, something tinged with a faint sadness. You're a smart girl. Your grades are excellent. But books don't win hearts, my dear. People do. The lesson was clear, and it was one he would repeat in 1,000 different ways over the years. Harriet's value was inherent, effortless, a matter of her very existence. My value was something to be earned, measured in test scores and quiet competence, but ultimately, it was a lesser currency. It was the currency of the staff, not the family. This dynamic solidified as we grew older. In our teens, Harriet's beauty became a strategic asset. When a difficult trade negotiation stalled, it would be 16-year-old Harriet, in a simple but elegant dress, who would be sent to charm the visiting dignitary's wife. It always worked. While she was being praised for her grace and poise, I would be in the back office, translating the fine print of the agreement from French to English, ensuring the commas were in the right places. My work was essential, but invisible. Her work was decorative, but celebrated. There was no malice in Harriet. She loved me, I have never doubted that. She would often sneak into the library where I studied, collapsing dramatically onto a chaise lounge, and complaining about the rigors of being charming. "It's exhausting, Lyra," she'd sigh. "You have to laugh at jokes that aren't funny and pretend to be fascinated by stories about polo ponies." And I would listen, offering her a quiet sympathy she didn't realize was tinged with a deep, aching envy. Not an envy for her beauty, but for the effortless way she belonged. She was a masterpiece hanging in the gallery. I was the placard on the wall beside it, providing the necessary but unglamorous context. Now, at 25, nothing had much changed, except the stakes had gotten higher. We were stationed in a grand old embassy in a neutral European capital, a city of stone bridges and quiet canals, and a crisis was brewing. The nations of Terran and Khaznia, two proud ancient countries with a long history of animosity, were rattling their sabers over a tiny chain of islands in the Azure Sea known as the Serpentine Isles. The islands were little more than windswept rocks, but they sat atop a recently discovered reserve of rare earth minerals and controlled a vital shipping lane. To Terran they were ancestral fishing grounds, mentioned in their epic poems. To Khaznia they were a strategic military outpost, a dagger pointed at their southern coast. For months the rhetoric had escalated. Now it had reached a fever pitch. War felt not just possible, but imminent. Our embassy was chosen as the site for a last-ditch negotiation, a final attempt to pull both nations back from the brink. Ambassador Hayes was to be the host, the facilitator, and for him this was the pinnacle of his career. The pressure was immense. The fate of thousands, perhaps millions, rested on what would happen within these walls. The preparations were frantic. The embassy was transformed. Staff scurried through the polished marble halls, their faces tight with anxiety. I was put in charge of the historical dossiers for both delegations. It was a mountain of work, compiling biographies, summarizing past treaties, researching cultural sensitivities. I worked for 3 days straight, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a desperate sense of purpose. I compiled a detailed report on the Tyrrhenian lead negotiator, Minister Valerius Kale. He was known as the Granite Man, a famously stubborn and humorless diplomat, but my research unearthed a fascinating detail. Before his political career, Kale had been a respected academic, a professor of ancient history with a specialization in pre-modern maritime law. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. It was a key to the man behind the granite facade. I highlighted it in my report, hoping the ambassador would see it, that he might use it to build a rapport. I should have known better. The evening before the delegations arrived, Ambassador Hayes called a final strategy meeting in his private study. The room smelled of old leather and furniture polish. He stood before the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking every inch the powerful diplomat. He addressed his core team, laying out their roles. Then he turned to Harriet, who was perched gracefully on the arm of a wingback chair. His entire demeanor softened. "Sarah, my dear," he said, his voice a low, confidential murmur, "your role is perhaps the most critical. Minister Kale is a difficult man, hard, unyielding. I need you to be our secret weapon. I want you to be a vision of warmth, of grace, a reminder of what we are all fighting to preserve. Peace, beauty." He instructed her on her wardrobe, soft colors, nothing too severe. He told her to engage the minister in light conversation, to offer him a glass of sherry, to smile. He was telling his daughter to be a beautiful distraction, a decorative object designed to soothe the savage beast. Harriet nodded, her expression serious, as if she were being given a vital intelligence briefing. Then, the ambassador's eyes flicked to me, where I stood by the door, holding my meticulously prepared folders. The warmth in his gaze vanished, replaced by a brisk, professional coolness. "Lyra," he said, not even looking at my report. "You'll be on standby. We'll need documents fetched, notes transcribed. Make sure the coffee is always fresh. We can't have any logistical hiccups." I felt a familiar hot flush of humiliation creep up my neck. I wanted to scream. I wanted to hold up my file and shout, "He's a historian. Talk to him about the Phoenician trade routes, not the weather." But I didn't. I just nodded, my throat tight. "Yes, Ambassador." As I left the study, I heard one of the junior attaches whisper to another, "She's so lucky Harriet is her friend. Imagine being her plain little shadow your whole life." The words were like tiny, sharp stones hitting my skin. They didn't break the skin, but they left 1,000 little bruises on the soul. I retreated to my sanctuary, the library. I ran my fingers along the spines of the old books, their leather covers cool and comforting. In this room, I wasn't a shadow. I was a scholar, an explorer. Here knowledge was the only currency that mattered, and in that currency, I was rich. I took a deep breath, the scent of aging paper calming my frayed nerves. The negotiations hadn't even begun, and I already felt a profound sense of defeat. I had no idea that the real battle wasn't going to be fought in the conference room, but right here, among these silent, forgotten shelves. The delegations arrived the next morning under a sky the color of slate. The air was thick with a tension that was almost meteorological, a low-pressure system of impending conflict. Black sedans with diplomatic flags swept up the gravel driveway, discharging stern-faced men in dark suits. Minister Valerius Kale of Taran was exactly as his reputation suggested. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe haircut and a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite, his eyes deep-set and wary. He moved with a stiff, formal gait, acknowledging Ambassador Hayes's welcome with a curt nod that bordered on dismissive. The Kaznian delegation, led by a shrewd, sharp-featured woman named Chancellor Anya Petrova, was equally grim. They were not here for pleasantries. They were here for a fight. And then there was Harriet. She descended the grand staircase just as the delegations were being shown into the main hall. She was wearing a dress of pale lilac silk that seemed to float around her, her golden hair swept up in a simple, elegant twist. She was a splash of soft color in a world of monochrome severity. As her father had instructed, she was a vision. A palpable sigh seemed to ripple through the assembled staff. Even the hardened diplomats paused for a fraction of a second, their stern expressions flickering with surprise and perhaps a touch of admiration. This, I thought with a familiar pang of resignation, was her power. My role, as designated, was to be invisible. I was stationed at a small desk in an alcove just off the main conference room, a nexus point for requests. I was the logistical ghost, the provider of files, water glasses, and fresh pens. From my vantage point, I could see and hear almost everything. Ambassador Hayes led the delegations into the Trianon room, a cavernous space with a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the grim faces of the men and women seated around it. The initial pleasantries were strained and brief. Roland Hayes, ever the consummate host, tried to inject a note of warmth. Minister Kale, Chancellor Petrova, may I say what an honor it is to host you. I trust we can find a path to a peaceful resolution that honors both your great nations. Minister Kale simply grunted in response, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for structural weaknesses. Chancellor Petrova offered a thin, brittle smile. Honor is a fine word, Ambassador, but it is territory we are here to discuss. The doors were closed, but the tension seeped out from under them like a toxic vapor. During the first break, Harriet made her move. She approached Minister Kale as he stood alone by a window, staring out at the rain-swept gardens. She held a small tray with a crystal decanter of sherry and 2 glasses. Minister, she said, her voice soft and musical, my father thought you might enjoy a glass of sherry. It's a rather fine vintage. Kale turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over her. It was not the look of a man being charmed. It was the look of a man analyzing a tactic. He saw the beautiful girl, the expensive sherry, the practiced smile, and he catalogued them as part of the diplomatic apparatus. He recognized the play. Thank you, Miss Hayes, he said, his voice a low rumble. But I do not drink before a negotiation is concluded. It dulls the senses. He didn't even look at the sherry. Harriet's smile faltered for just a moment. Of course, Minister. Perhaps just some conversation then. The gardens are quite lovely, even in the rain. He looked out the window again. They are gardens. Soil, water, and chlorophyll. Their loveliness is subjective and has no bearing on the strategic importance of a deep water port. He turned and walked away, leaving Harriet standing there, holding the tray, her face a mask of stunned silence. I saw the whole exchange from my alcove. I felt a surge of something complex, a bitter satisfaction that her charm had failed, immediately followed by a wave of protective sympathy for my friend. She looked so lost, so utterly out of her depth. I wanted to tell her, it's not your fault. He's not a man who can be swayed by beauty. He's a man who respects substance. I wanted to march over to Ambassador Hayes and show him the highlighted line in my report. He's a historian. Ask him about the Treaty of Westphalia. Ask him about Grotius and the law of the sea. But the moment passed, the delegates filed back into the room, and the heavy doors boomed shut once more. For the rest of the day, I sat at my desk, listening to the muffled sounds of raised voices from behind the closed doors. Every so often, an aide would burst out, his face pale, demanding I find some obscure treaty from 1952 or a specific United Nations resolution. I found them all, my fingers flying through digital archives and physical files, my mind a calm sea of information in the midst of their emotional storm. I was efficient, I was invaluable, and I was completely and utterly unseen. As the afternoon wore on, the shouting grew louder. Words like unacceptable, violation, and consequences drifted through the thick oak doors. Ambassador Hayes's strategy was failing, and failing spectacularly. The beautiful distraction had been dismissed, and all that was left was the hard, intractable core of the dispute. Late in the day, Roland himself came out of the room. His face was ashen, his usual confident posture slightly stooped. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. He didn't even see me as he walked past my desk, his eyes focused on some distant point of failure. He found Harriet, who was sitting alone in a small salon, staring into a cold fireplace. "You need to try again," he told her, his voice a harsh, desperate whisper. "Find a way. Talk to him about his family, his home. Anything. We are losing, Sarah. You must do something." Harriet looked up at her father, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of defiance in her sky-blue eyes. "Father," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "he doesn't want to talk to me. He thinks I'm a frivolous girl. He sees me as an insult to his intelligence." Roland ran a hand through his perfectly styled silver hair, dislodging it for the first time I could remember. "Then be more intelligent," he hissed, his desperation making him cruel. "I don't care how you do it. Just fix it." He turned and stalked back toward the conference room, leaving his daughter looking utterly crushed. Her gift, the one he had praised her entire life, had been weighed and found wanting. The currency of her beauty had just been declared worthless. She caught my eye from across the hall, and her expression was one of pure, unadulterated despair. In that moment, she wasn't a diplomatic asset or a celebrated beauty. She was just my friend, and she was drowning. The first day of negotiations ended not with a bang, but with a cold, simmering silence that was far more terrifying. The delegations departed without a word, their faces set like stone. The Trianon room, when the staff finally opened it, looked like a battlefield. Overturned water glasses, crumpled notes, and an atmosphere thick with animosity. War, which had been a distant threat, now felt like a guest in the next room, patiently waiting to be invited in. The embassy that night was a ghost ship. Staff spoke in hushed whispers, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls. The weight of failure was a physical presence, pressing down on all of us. Ambassador Hayes locked himself in his study. I could hear the clink of ice in a glass every time I passed the door. He was a man adrift, his diplomatic compass shattered. Harriet had retreated to her suite, refusing to come out. I knocked on her door, but she only called through, her voice thick with tears. "Please, Lyra, I just want to be alone." She was facing a crisis she had never encountered before, a problem that her beauty could not solve. It was a fundamental blow to her identity, to the very foundation of the world her father had built for her. I couldn't rest. The sense of impending doom was a current under my skin. I knew that fetching files and making coffee was not enough. I felt like a doctor who was only being asked to hand out bandages while the patient was bleeding out internally. The key, I felt with a certainty that was almost irrational, was in the history. The dispute was framed in modern terms: minerals, shipping lanes, military advantage, but the roots of it were ancient. The animosity between Terran and Casnia was 1,000 years old, a tapestry woven from forgotten slights, broken promises, and divergent histories. While the diplomats were shouting about the present, I felt compelled to whisper about the past. I went back to the library. The room was dark, save for a single green-shaded lamp on a large reading table. The silence was a balm. This was my territory. Here I was not a shadow, I was in command. I pulled down every book I could find on the history of the Serpentine Isles. Ancient maps, maritime histories, translations of Tyrrhenian sagas and Casnian chronicles. I spread them out on the table, the pages brittle and smelling of dust and time. For hours I read, I cross-referenced, I fell down rabbit holes of historical inquiry. Most of it was useless, poetic descriptions of sea monsters, exaggerated claims of ancient kings. But then I found it. It was a footnote in a dry, academic text from the early 20th century, a book on medieval trade charters. The footnote mentioned a document called the Concord of the Twin Tides, an alleged treaty signed in the 12th century between a Tyrrhenian sea lord and a Casnian prince. The footnote described the treaty not as a document of conquest, but of co-stewardship, establishing the islands as a neutral ground for sailors from both nations to take shelter from storms. The author dismissed it as likely apocryphal, as the original text had been lost to time. Lost to time. The phrase snagged in my mind. Things weren't always lost. Sometimes they were just misplaced. An idea, wild and desperate, began to form. This embassy was one of the oldest in Europe. Its library archives were a chaotic labyrinth, a collection of collections, bought in bulk from bankrupt aristocrats over centuries. It was notoriously disorganized, a librarian's nightmare. What if the Concorde wasn't lost? What if it was just here? The thought was absurd, a one-in-a-million long shot, but it was better than sitting by and watching the world burn. I descended into the sub-basement archives, a place most staff avoided. It was cold and damp, a maze of towering metal shelves groaning under the weight of uncatalogued history. I found the section dedicated to acquisitions from the 19th century, the period when the academic text was written. It was a chaotic mess of leather-bound ledgers, bundled scrolls, and wooden crates. I started searching. It was painstaking work. My hands became covered in dust. My eyes burned from the dim light. I scanned acquisition logs written in elegant but faded copperplate script, searching for any mention of Tyrrhenian or Casnian artifacts. Hours bled into one another. Midnight came and went. The silence of the archive was absolute, broken only by the rustle of paper and my own steady breathing. Sometime around 3 a.m, when my hope was beginning to fray, Harriet appeared at the entrance to the archive, a pale ghost in a silk robe. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "What on earth are you doing down here?" I looked up from a dusty ledger, a smudge of dirt on my cheek. I was too tired to be anything but direct. "I'm looking for something," I said. "A 12th century treaty that might not exist." I explained my theory about the Concorde of the Twin Tides. As I spoke, laying out the historical context and the slimmest of chances that the document could be here, I saw something shift in her expression. The self-pity began to recede, replaced by a look of dawning wonder. She was seeing me, truly seeing me, perhaps for the first time, not as her quiet friend, not as the bookish girl in the background, but as a serious person engaged in serious work. "A treaty of co-stewardship," she repeated, her brow furrowed in concentration. "So, neither of them owned it? They shared it?" I nodded, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "That's what the footnote suggests. It reframes the entire historical premise of the dispute. It's not about who has the rightful claim, it's about a shared heritage they've both forgotten." Harriet sank down onto a wooden stool, wrapping her arms around her knees. She was silent for a long moment, watching me as I turned back to my search. "All day today," she said finally, her voice barely audible, "I was trying to be a distraction. Father wanted me to be a piece of art, something pleasant to look at to take their minds off the ugly business. But it's not about distraction, is it?" She looked around the dusty, forgotten archive. "The answer isn't in making them forget the past, it's in making them remember the right part of it." The insight was so clear, so perfectly articulated, that I stopped what I was doing and stared at her. She had spent her life being told her value was on the surface, but in her moment of crisis, she had found a profound depth. "Yes," I said, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time that day. "That's it exactly." She stood up, a new resolve in her eyes. "Well, you can't search this whole place by yourself. What are we looking for?" For the rest of the night we worked together. Harriet, the celebrated beauty, her silk robe now smudged with century-old dust, carefully lifting heavy ledgers while I scanned the contents. We were no longer the beauty and the brain, the masterpiece and the placard. We were just two friends, united in a desperate, improbable quest, searching for a forgotten piece of paper in the basement of the world. The second day of talks dawned with a sense of grim finality. The mood in the embassy was funereal. The consensus among the staff was that this was no longer a negotiation. It was a formality before a declaration of war. Ambassador Hayes emerged from his study, looking hollowed out, the failure already etched onto his face. He saw Harriet and me coming up from the archives, both of us disheveled and covered in dust, and he just shook his head with a look of weary disappointment, as if our shared state of disarray was just another symptom of the chaos he had failed to control. He didn't even ask what we'd been doing. The delegations were scheduled to meet at 10 o'clock for one final session. Everyone knew it was a prelude to collapse. Minister Kale and Chancellor Petrova would make their final, uncompromising statements, and then they would go home to mobilize their armies. At 9:45 my search ended. It was in a long cylindrical leather case, tucked away inside a crate marked Miscellaneous Maritime Charts. It hadn't been on any of the logs I'd checked. It was just there. My hands trembled as I opened the case. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a scroll of heavy vellum, its edges sealed with a wax emblem so old it had cracked into a spider web of fine lines. I carefully unrolled it. The text was written in a spidery, archaic script, a language I recognized instantly from my studies. It was an ancient Tyrrhenian maritime dialect, a linguistic ancestor of the modern language, but so different as to be almost unrecognizable. It was a language that hadn't been spoken in 600 years, but I could read it, and as my eyes scanned the opening lines, my heart hammered against my ribs. The heading, written in ornate, faded gold leaf, was unmistakable: the Concord of the Twin Tides. I had found it. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted up the service stairs, the scroll clutched in my hand like a holy relic. I burst out into the main hall just as the delegates were being ushered toward the Trianon room. "Wait," I cried out, my voice raw and breathless. Every head turned toward me. The entire hall fell silent. I was a mess. My hair was falling out of its bun, my blouse was rumpled, and there was a prominent streak of dust across my forehead. In that hall of immaculate suits and polished shoes, I was a jarring note of chaos. Ambassador Hayes turned, his face a thundercloud of fury and embarrassment. "Lyra, what is the meaning of this? Get back to your post immediately." He started toward me, his hand outstretched as if to physically remove me. This was the ultimate humiliation for him, his ward, the quiet little mouse, making a scene in front of the most important men and women of his career. But before he could reach me, Harriet moved. She stepped directly into his path, placing a hand on his chest. It was a quiet, simple gesture, but it had the force of a tectonic plate shifting. She had never in her entire life stood up to her father like this. "Father," she said, her voice low but ringing with an authority I had never heard before. "Stop. You need to listen to her, now." Roland Hayes froze, his mouth slightly agape. He stared at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. The beautiful, pliable girl was gone. In her place stood a woman of conviction. The momentary standoff gave me the opening I needed. I walked forward, my legs shaking but my purpose firm. I stopped in front of Minister Kale. His granite face was unreadable, but his eyes, the eyes of a scholar, were fixed on the ancient scroll in my hands. "Minister," I said, my voice steadier now. "Chancellor, Ambassador. For centuries, the dispute over the Serpentine Isles has been based on the premise of singular, exclusive ownership." I took a deep breath. "That premise is historically false." A murmur went through the assembled aides. Chancellor Petrova raised a skeptical eyebrow. "A rather bold claim from a research assistant," she said, her tone dripping with ice. I ignored her. My focus was on Kale. His gaze had not left the scroll. "This," I said, carefully unrolling the vellum on a nearby console table, "is the Concord of the Twin Tides. Signed in the year 1182 by Lord Kalen of Terran, your ancestor, minister and Prince Omri of Casnia." Kale's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He took a step closer, peering at the text. He recognized the script. He knew what he was looking at. "It's written in an old sea dialect," I continued, my confidence surging as I stepped onto the firm ground of my expertise. "It is not a treaty of ownership. It is a treaty of shared sanctuary. It establishes the islands not as a territory to be possessed, but as a joint protectorate, a place of refuge for the sailors and fishermen of both nations. It grants equal rights to harbor and sustenance. It speaks not of borders, but of a shared embrace of the sea." I looked up from the scroll and met Minister Kale's gaze. "Your nations were not fighting over who owned the islands. You were meant to be protecting them, together." The silence in the hall was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock at the far end. Minister Kale, the granite man, reached out a hand, his fingers hesitating just above the ancient vellum, as if he were afraid it might turn to dust. "Translate," he commanded, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Translate the passage on fishing rights." And so I did. Standing there in the grand hall, disheveled and overlooked, I began to translate the forgotten words of his ancestors. My voice, which had been silent for so long, filled the space, weaving a story of cooperation and mutual respect that had been buried under 8 centuries of hatred and mistrust. The diplomats, the aides, my foster father, my best friend, they all stood in a circle, listening. The focus of the entire world in that moment was not on a general or a president or a celebrated beauty. It was on me, Lyra, the girl from the library, and the long-dead words that I had brought back to life. The war had been put on hold, postponed by a ghost. The immediate aftermath was a blur of controlled, high-level chaos. The final session was, of course, postponed indefinitely. Minister Kale and Chancellor Petrova, for the first time showing a united front, sequestered themselves with the scroll. Teams of experts, philologists, historians, legal scholars were flown in from both Terran and Casnia on emergency flights. The embassy transformed from a site of confrontation to one of intense collaborative academic inquiry. And I was at the center of it all. I spent the next 48 hours in the Trianon room, the same room where the world had been about to end, working alongside the most respected scholars from 2 nations. They treated me not as a research assistant, but as a peer, a colleague. They deferred to my interpretation of the obscure dialect. They marveled at the depth of my knowledge. For the first time in my life, I was not just in the room, I was the most important person in the room. My voice was the one they leaned in to hear. I felt a sense of belonging so profound it was almost dizzying. This was where I was meant to be. Ambassador Hayes watched the proceedings from the periphery. His expression was a complex, unreadable mixture of emotions. I saw pride, yes, but it was tangled with a deep, unsettling shame. He had possessed the key to peace in his own house for 25 years and had been utterly blind to it. He had been looking for a beautiful lockpick when what he'd needed was a master locksmith. On the second evening, after a marathon 16-hour session verifying the Concord's authenticity, he found me alone in the small salon, nursing a cup of tea. He stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. "Lyra," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual booming authority. He trailed off, struggling for words. He, a man who had built a career on eloquent speeches, was rendered speechless. "I owe you an apology," he finally managed, his eyes not quite meeting mine. A profound one. I was so focused on the surfaces, the presentation. I never saw the depth. Your mind, your work. I took it for granted. I treated it as a utility, not a gift. There is no excuse for it. I was a fool. It wasn't a perfect apology. It was halting, clumsy, and centered as much on his failure as it was on my value. But it was real. It was the sound of a man's entire worldview cracking. "You didn't just find a document, Lyra," he continued, finally looking at me. "You gave us a new story. A better one. You saved us. You saved me." I simply nodded, accepting the words. Forgiveness was a more complicated matter, something that would take time, but this acknowledgement was the first step on a long road. Later that night, Harriet found me in the library. She was carrying a tray with 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate, just as she had when we were girls and I was studying for an exam. She curled up on the chaise lounge, her face luminous in the lamplight. There was no trace of the broken girl from 2 days ago. She looked serene, confident. "They're calling you the librarian of peace in the press briefings," she said with a smile. "It has a nice ring to it." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the way only lifelong friends can. "I'm sorry, Lyra," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. "For all of it. For every time I took the compliment and didn't point out that you'd done the real work. For every time I let Father put me on a pedestal and leave you in the shadows. I benefited from it. I liked the attention, and I never stopped to think about what it must have felt like for you. It was lazy, and it was selfish, and I'm sorry." Tears pricked my eyes. This was the apology that mattered most. This was the one that healed something deep inside me. "I was the distraction," she said, echoing her earlier realization. "And I think I was distracting myself too. It was easier to be beautiful than to try and be anything else. You showed me that's not true." She looked at me, her blue eyes full of a fierce protective love. "You're the most brilliant person I've ever known. I should have been shouting it from the rooftops all along." From that day forward, our friendship was different. It was no longer a relationship of orbits, with me circling her sun. We were 2 stars of equal brightness, side by side. A few weeks later, Harriet announced that she had applied and been accepted to a prestigious university to study international relations and history. She wanted to understand the substance, not just be the surface. A year can change everything. The document I found became the foundation for the Serpentine Accord, a landmark treaty that not only averted the war, but created a new model for resolving historical disputes. The islands became a jointly administered international park and scientific research outpost, a symbol of cooperation rather than conflict. My life was completely transformed. The story of the library discovery had become a minor legend in diplomatic circles. I was no longer an anonymous researcher. I was offered a newly created position within the diplomatic corps, Senior Historical Counsel. My job was to lead a team that proactively researched the deep historical contexts of global conflicts, searching for forgotten precedents and alternative narratives that could unlock peaceful solutions. I was no longer providing footnotes, I was helping to write the headlines. I had a corner office with a view of the city, but I spent most of my time in archives and libraries around the world, doing the work I loved, but now with a profound sense of purpose and recognition. I advised committees, briefed ambassadors, and my opinion was not just heard but actively sought. The feeling of being seen, of being valued for the contents of my mind, was a quiet, steady warmth that settled deep in my bones. My relationship with Ambassador Hayes settled into a new, respectful equilibrium. He was still Roland, but the casual dismissal was gone, replaced by a genuine deference to my expertise. He would often call me to ask my opinion on a new posting or a brewing crisis, listening intently to my analysis. He was a man humbled, and in some ways a better diplomat for it. He had learned, the hard way, that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a missile or even a beautiful smile, but a well-read mind. Harriet thrived at university. She attacked her studies with a passion that surprised everyone but me. She was no longer just a pretty face in the lecture hall. She was a sharp, inquisitive mind, her natural charm now paired with a formidable intellect. Our bond was unbreakable, forged anew in the crucible of that crisis. We spoke every week, our conversations a mix of geopolitical analysis and the simple, comfortable chatter of best friends. We were finally equals in every sense of the word. I learned that being underestimated, while painful, had been my secret advantage. While the world was busy looking at Harriet, no one was looking at me, and in that invisibility, I was free. I was free to observe, to learn, to read, to think. I built an entire world inside myself, a fortress of knowledge that no one knew existed until the day it was needed to save them. True value isn't about being the person everyone sees. It's about having a vision that helps everyone else see the world differently. And true power isn't about commanding the spotlight. It's about being able to light a candle in the dark. My story is one of shadows and light, of silence and finally, of speaking up. And it leads me to wonder about all of you. Your worth is not determined by the applause you receive or the attention you command. It's built in the quiet hours, in the dedication to your passion, in the knowledge you accumulate when no one is watching. I want you to share your story in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated? How did you prove your worth, not just to others but to yourself? Your stories matter, and they deserve to be heard. If my journey resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding your voice. Sharing this video with someone who might feel invisible could be the spark they need. Remember that the world often makes the mistake of judging a book by its cover. Let them. It just gives you the time and space to write a truly magnificent story on the pages within. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and thank you for listening.